Next item on the agenda.
Item B, District Multiple Measures and SIP. Dr. Gwen Maleko, Dr. Dan Patterson, and Dr. Fatmi Faraj.
Good evening, Dr. Maleko and board trustees. Ms. Faraj and I tonight are going to be co-presenting on our school improvement process and our recent student achievement data, just because the two are so closely related to each other. So I'm going to have Ms. Faraj start off talking a little bit about our school improvement plan.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Okay, so we know that it should be a collaborative effort between schools and the district to achieve the mission and the vision of the strategic plan that you have seen a couple weeks ago. And it is a must and a push for us to stay with live implementation of the school improvement process because of what you just heard from Dr. Maleko. Looking at the scorecard this year, it was calculated differently than this past year. So it was very difficult for us to compare last year to this year. How do we implement school improvement in the district so it is effective and it's authentic and it reflects what we do in the district and the schools? We have a process in place that is locally developed, and it's been implemented since 2006. It is constantly revisited and reviewed based on new research and resources. For example, the process that we started in 2006 did not include digital learning. This year we have revised the process to include how the digital tools are being used in the classroom. Are they being used as tools where students are working with them in isolation, or are they being used as tools for learning? So that's why the process continues to be improvised to reflect current changes and research. The process is also streamlined through a measurable tool to help our district and schools build on strengths and identify focus areas using classroom evidence. The process in Dearborn Public Schools that we're using, it has always and continues to be following a cycle of data gathering, data analysis, planning, and implementation. And this is the reason you see both presentations combined today, because data analysis and the multiple measures are the most important factors in the school improvement process. This year, in August, we did a revision that was unlike the previous years because we felt that we needed to be looking at learning in the classroom through the same lens. For example, I will be explaining the process in a minute, how the visiting team visits schools and what we do when visit schools. I will just show you the rubric that we developed as a team, and everyone in the district was involved in the process, where we have a type of a matrix that looks at student learning in the classroom. When we visit schools, we measure the level of implementation, and on this rubric we have the high impact strategies that affect student learning in the classroom. We also have many of the topics that you've heard through tonight's presentations, for example, Care to the Core, My Learning Plan, the co-teaching model, or any other initiative that the district is part of the district. We look to see if it's implemented in the school. So we look for visuals, we look for evidence when we go to the schools. And this has been used since September. It is really driving rigorous conversation between teachers, principals, central office staff during the visits. Much of the professional development also is aligned with this rubric. The school improvement plans align with that we have in the district, also aligns with the district strategic plan to ensure that all students are achieving at high levels. The plan is designed to help all schools move forward with continuous improvement involving all stakeholders. When we say stakeholders, we mean students, parents, teachers, administrators, central office staff, and everyone. We do not forget that we have lengthy reports for the MDE and the advanced ed, And we try as much as we could, and I think we're successful at that, to align their requirements with our school improvement plan steps, initiatives, strategies, and goals. How does our school improvement process that we implement in the district relate to the strategic plan? One of the CPIs is professional learning community, which is, again, the heart of school improvement. And what came out of the focus areas is that we have to implement the process involving all stakeholders, communicate the reason why we use the data analysis, and why do we have to make these specific instructional decisions, create the opportunities for the professional learning communities to happen in the school, and provide assistance to the school staff to implement them. Establish a sense of urgency and a culture of owning up to existing gaps with all stakeholders. Dr. Maleko talked about the state changing their measures and the way they measure and judge the schools based on a specific measure. Yes, we do know that, we're aware of this, but we do as much as we could own up to the expectations, and we work very hard to meet those guidelines. Offer professional development and PLC coaching around use of existing systems to assess and organize data, and model the use of this process. How do we do it? We create protocols. We go to the buildings. Dan and I work very closely together to make it much simpler to the principals, because data digging or data gathering is the hardest part of it, because you have too many different portals or state websites or resources that you have to obtain in order to put it in front of the staff and have them work on it. And of course, monitor the process through checkpoints. The measures that are mostly effective are the ones that are utilized more than once a year. For example, NWA and the NDRA and other progress monitoring tools. So, sorry, I skipped. Okay, so part of this process too this year is we created a diagnostic tool, which is called the School Data Profile. And this diagnostic tool does not only include 2 or 3 measures. It includes data on student achievement, outcome or achievement. It includes perception data. What do our stakeholders think of what we're doing? What do our students think of how they're learning? What do our parents think of how we're giving them services? And what do the teachers think of the administrative staff and how they're providing support? And again, what do the schools think of in terms of central office services? So this is called perception data. And based on the results of the analysis of this data, we tweak our practices to make sure that we're providing the best services we could. Again, we help the principals and the school staff by providing sample questions on how to look at the data, how to describe it, how to analyze it, how to interpret it, and how to come up with implications that are applicable in the classroom. So this process has been very helpful because it's very authentic, and it drives home because the students, the teachers, the principals, and everyone is involved in the process. Achievement gaps are identified across multiple measures because triangulation of data is one of the key factors to make sure that this gap exists across multiple measures. We cannot take one measure and judge our practices, change our school improvement plan strategy or goal based on one measure. So we have to use triangulation in the process.
Okay, so for example, this is a sample of some of the reports that schools use at the beginning of the year and throughout the year for their school improvement process. One of the things that's very important is to we're trying to assist the principals who have always been very good at looking at data, but we're trying to make things easier for them so that way they can focus their attention in other places. So, for example, one of the graphs in the upper left-hand corner is showing changes in students in their WIDA level, because one of the expectations of the WIDA exam, which assesses English language development, is that students gain a level each year. So this is showing how many students increased a level, maintained a level, or perhaps decreased a level. And so what we try to do is tie that to our student information system to where we can actually identify those students that might not be making the gains that we would like them to, so we can intervene as quickly as possible. So these are just some of the reports that we offer to the principals to help analyze their data. And then I don't know if you want to talk about the 4 types of data that we use.
I kind of mentioned that we use perception. First, demographic, and again, we had the principals involve all teachers in the demographic data. For example, mobility. How does mobility affect the students in my classroom or the students in my building? Looking at enrollment trends, looking at discipline data. Who are the students who are being suspended? Are they the same students? Who are the students who are chronically absent? Do we really need to dig deeper and find out who they are, contact their parents? So demographic data is very important, and it really can have some findings that would impact the practice in the school. And teachers were involved in this along with their principals. Achievement, and I wanted to thank Dan because it would be a huge task on the principals if they had to go and pull out this data, and we did work together, and he generated files for the principals through a slicer, and all they had to do is click on their school and they got this information. So we saved them the time of gathering the data, and they used that time to sit with their staff and look at them. We also provided the questions for them on how to go about that. It was a good process for the staff and principals. Achievement outcome, again, like Dr. Patterson mentioned, it's the assessment that measures student performance and growth too, not only proficiency. Perception is the surveys that we administer, and we administer to all stakeholders every year. And the process data is monitoring the school improvement practices. How are they happening? What do we need to tweak? What are the good practices that we need to sustain? Are we complacent, or do we need to make some changes? We never stop. It's a fluid process that is always driving a new practice that will improve our schools. And I don't know if you wanted to, we're going to invite you to, if you can, to come to one of the visits to observe how it's happening.
Okay, so we're going to take a few slides to look at our recent student achievement data. First, I would just like to remind everyone what the requirements of state testing are, since this is something we usually talk about once a year. In English language arts, we're required to assess in grades 3 through 8 and once in high school. One of the changes that the state made in the last year was that we switched from, actually in 3 years we've made 3 changes. We've gone from the ACT in 11th grade to the M-STEP, and then last year for the first time we gave the redesigned SAT as our measure of English language arts and mathematics. And then in social studies and science, we're required to assess once in elementary, middle, and high school, and you can see the grades that we do that in there. So we have similar requirements under the new Every Student Succeeds Act. Although the state is proposing further changes to testing, currently the proposal is that we will keep M-STEP in 1 grade in elementary and 1 in middle school and replace that in the other grades with another assessment. But that plan is still going forward, and that will have to be approved by the federal government before we make any of those changes, and that will be another year or 2 before any of those changes take place. So a few things I just wanted to highlight is that because of our continual kind of shifts in assessment and accountability, we are actually kind of resetting the playing field again this year, and 2015-16 is supposed to be considered a new baseline for all of our data, just because of the changes that we've seen. Our district was one of about 15% of the districts in the state that went from paper and pencil testing to online testing, and most districts that experienced that did see a dip in our assessment scores last year. And our district is still above state averages in many areas. In most cases, we're within about a point or 2 of district averages and above the Wayne-Risa averages. But we're continuing to make sure that we meet the expectations of the new standards in the English language arts and math standards, and then also the newly adopted next generation science standards that we're transitioning to as well. So in this first slide, we're taking a look at our English language arts results from the last year. In grades 3 through 8, this is measured by M-STEP, but I included in this graph the 11th grade SAT scores because it's meant to be kind of a continuous measure of college and career readiness. As you can see, in grades 3 through 8, roughly about, on average, around 50% of our students are college and career readiness, considered proficient or advanced, which is another way of saying college and career readiness. In 5th grade, we happen to be slightly above the state average, but in most of the other grades, we're within about a point or two of state averages and above the other averages of the county. In mathematics, although the results are typically lower than what we see for language arts, we happen to be above state averages in many of the grades. And the grades that we happen to be not at the state average were, again, within about a point or two. As you can see, results kind of statewide happen to be typically lower for mathematics than they are for language arts. And then for science and social studies, this is one assessment that did stay fairly similar among the 2 years. We did see growth in all of the areas in these 2 assessments, although we still happen to be, kind of similar to state averages across the board with science and social studies. And as we mentioned, we take a look at several different measures in terms of student achievement. One measure that you might not be as familiar with is our NWA assessment, which is called MAP, or Measures of Academic Progress. So I wanted to take a moment just to talk a little bit about the characteristics of the assessment, and then we'll take a look at student achievement data. So this first slide that I'm showing you is just meant to show you some characteristics of the assessment. This is an assessment that we administer from kindergarten through 8th grade, and we give it 3 times a year as a measure of student growth. So this is an assessment that has a vertically aligned scale. So students in kindergarten are meant to score lower on the scale. As they get up to 8th grade, they're expected to score higher on the scale. And as we take a look from administration to administration, changes in their number are meant to show student growth from administration to administration. So on the left side of this graph, you can see that the scores range from about 140 up to about 250. And the range goes from kindergarten up through 8th grade. And the labels at the bottom, the F, W, and S, are for fall, winter, and spring, which are the 3 times that we administer the assessment. So in kindergarten, you can see that there's actually about a 18 to 20 point gain in this score, which we refer to as a RIT score, that is expected to take place in kindergarten. And in 1st grade, you'll see that it's fairly similar. As we move across the grades, student growth typically tails off a little bit, and it doesn't become quite as pronounced as you see in the early elementary grades. Now, this assessment is what we refer to as a norm-referenced assessment. So student achievement results are reported back as both what's referred to as a RIT score, which is a point on the scale, and then also as a percentile. And the percentile shows where students are in place of a national norming group, which is supposed to be representative of all of the students that take this MAP assessment across the nation. It's not necessarily representative of the entire nation because this isn't a required test, but they do have customers in every state across the nation, so it should be fairly representative of student achievement. So the black line that you're seeing is actually the 50th percentile, so this is what would be expected of the average student in each of those grades, ranging from kindergarten through 8th grade. Now, because it's a norm reference test, it doesn't set a achievement level similar to M-STEP or SAT that shows this is where a student would be to be at grade level or college and career ready or at the proficient or advanced level. So one thing that NWA has done is done some linking studies to take a look at students and how they did on the ACT and backward mapped it to scores on the map. And that's what the lines in orange and purple are. The green and purple. So the green line is where students that scored at the ACT of a 22 would be, which is around the 69th, 70th percentile. And it's actually considered that an ACT score of 24 is probably more representative of college and career readiness, just because many exclusive colleges don't accept students, below that level. And that's more in like the 75th percentile. So the next few slides, we're just going to take this picture and then add our student achievement data to it. So the next slide is showing our reading achievement. And as you can see, most of our students enter being somewhat below the district averages. But one thing that our scores showed last year was that although our scores were kind of below the average norm scores, we had greater than average growth on every single measure in reading, math, language, and science each year. And you can see that because the blue lines, which represent our students' data, are slightly steeper than what you see in the black and green and purple lines.
Can I ask a question real quick? I like this chart. I haven't seen one like that before. But I'm assuming that it can really tell you where the summer gap falls, or the summer learning decrease shows between, if you're going from grade to grade, you can see where they ended off and then where they start off the next year. Yes,
exactly. And as you can see from the end of the spring score from second grade and the fall score from third grade, you can see that there's a little bit of a dip there. So across the nation, schools typically experience a summer learning loss. And you can see that it's a little more pronounced in several of our students here because that drop is a little bit greater. Although during the year we do make up that gap at a higher rate than we see across the nation. Yes, but that's exactly true. Okay, so the next slide is showing the similar trend just for mathematics achievement. One thing that I did want to just point out is in second grade, you'll notice that our blue line kind of exceeds the norms. That's because we're administering an assessment that is geared kind of transitioning kids from second grade to third grade, and we're having all of our students take that assessment, and most likely we need to start transitioning a few of our students to take the second through fifth grade assessment, just because that is probably a little more appropriate for their learning levels. So that's probably a slightly higher score than what we would anticipate if students were taking one that was more geared to where they were at that point in the year. Typically that's a year where students would transition from the kindergarten and first grade test into the second grade test somewhere in the year, depending on how well they're doing. And then the last slide is showing our science scores, and you can see similar trends to where our students, start typically below the national average, but within the school year, we're making up the difference at a higher rate than we see across the nation as average. And then in terms of what we are doing is, as everyone has said tonight, we don't encourage test prep skills. We think that narrowing the curriculum really does a disservice to students and teachers. And although we did see some dips in scores as we transitioned online, we're not focusing on just test prep skills for online test taking. We're not putting students in front of computers just practicing the items that they would see on the M-STEP. We do want to make sure that students are exposed to the types of skills that they'll see. For example, students compose their essays by, typing it online, with a keyboard. So we just want to make sure that students have an opportunity to do that a few times throughout the year to make sure that they learn those keyboarding skills, because we don't want that to get in the way of seeing their actual progress towards the state standards. We're continuing to align our instruction to the higher rigor of the Michigan state standards as well as the next generation science standards. It's really important to make sure that we understand the design principles of the new assessments, which are trying to assess higher order thinking skills. So for example, the Michigan math standards are really two separate standards. We have the content standards, which have objectives like students will learn fractions, they'll learn how to solve equations. But then we also have 8 mathematical practices that kind of cover all grades from K through 12. And in those, we want students to persevere in problem solving, reason abstractly. We want them to model with mathematics. We want them to construct arguments, create arguments. And those are where we consider the higher order thinking skills. So understanding how some of these assessments take those kind of abstract notions and develop items to show students' proficiency is, I think, useful tools for us to take a look at, because those are similar things we we have to do in the classroom when we're looking at the standards and trying to see how well we're aligning to these college and career ready expectations. And as we mentioned in our SIP process, we're looking at gaps in achievement and trying to identify students with targeted interventions. And as Ms. Faraz mentioned, that if any of you would like to have more information about the process, we have a link there, and you're welcome to join us on any of the SIP visits, and we have a schedule attached. Yes.
I
So
just wanted
any
to say,
questions?
yeah, I want to first go back actually to the presentation right before you, because I think it's important to know that without having a superintendent who understands the philosophy behind improvement in education and how to adequately improve and go forward, I think is really important, especially when it comes to testing, and it leads the way for yourself and for Dr. Faraj to do some of the great things that you guys are doing. I do appreciate that you guys are going into all the individual schools, creating the rubrics, that they're the same across the board. And we know that testing obviously is changing. It's going to continue to change. I'm just happy that regardless of what happens with the testing, that we're looking at our rubrics and how we are seeing the improvement in the individual schools, because when we look at the testing, we don't know what the next test is going to look like or be, and we don't know if the kids that are taking those tests are just having a bad day on that day. And so to be able to measure the achievement based on what's constantly happening in the schools instead of one test given at one part of the year, I think is important for the parents to know. It's important for the teachers to understand, and I really give so much kudos to the administration for doing this and taking that route. So thank you so much. I know it's very labor intensive. It's probably very complicated, and so I thank you both, and I thank Dr. Maleko for leading that effort. So,
Yep, agreed.
I did attend one SIP last year because it happened to be in my neighborhood school, but it was the second one, so I didn't see the start, so I want to get this year to see the beginning point rather than the outcome for the second visit. That being said, we know we have a huge variety in our school district when it comes to student makeup and types of educational opportunities. It's not just your generic K through 12. We have a lot of different programs out there from STEM, STEAM, DCMST, and all of those incorporate the dual enrollment programs, the early colleges, that all play a part in the way these test scores, because all of these students are still involved in the testing data. One of the things that I'm curious about is because there is so much individuality in each building and the type of learning that's occurring in our buildings, how do we go about determining when we see, if we're just using strictly data and the data is the same across the board for every building because it's the same testing that we are starting with in order to define what needs to be improved in a building? What kind of improvements are going to work in that particular building? Is that left up strictly to the building principal, the administration there, and the staff, or do we have some bag of tricks that we give them when we see what the data is showing us? How do we formulate the plan?
I can comment. I can let Ms. Faraj comment too, but if I could just make one comment on this, just joining in, and I appreciate you being at the SIP visit. That's where I think that, my presentation talked about what really measures effectiveness, and then what do you do as the next step.
Right.
And so our process of school improvement that we have in the district, I think is, other districts do it, but I don't think the same way necessarily we do it. And it's very intensive, and that's where a lot of that data is collected, that individuality. But we still come back to the strategic plan with what you were saying, the bag of tricks. Well, that's where our administrators and our teachers get trained on those specific research-based strategies. And so what you'll get a lot of times, and I know Ms. Farage wants to comment, is that through that rubric, we're then making specific recommendations. One of the areas where it individualizes for the students that we've really pushed is, of course, you're going to look at their individual data, but then how do you get them to the next step? If you go into any class in Dearborn and visit with any student, you will see something called a My Learning Plan. And every student will set goals, both personal and academic, and then they also will track their own data in most cases, and we're looking to enhance it. So that's a way to kind of get down and individualize, but the same token, there's all these research-based best practices, strategies that we provide support on a district level. And at our general administrators meeting, we have several what that meeting is with all the principals that I have monthly. Mm-hmm. And then we have our feeder track meetings and our principal meetings. There's all sorts of training sessions that we're now providing for the principals, and then that trickles into as well with the teachers. So I'll let Ms. Farage comment.
I will continue because I had the same thoughts that Dr. Maleko just articulated. The rubric that I showed earlier had several elements in it. One of them is data analysis. One of them is using data to measure student achievement and drive the next steps. But if you look, you have the content and language objectives. That's one measure. These are high-impact strategies that were taken from research-based models. For example, the Elliott tool that's used by Advanced Ed. This measures classroom learning environments in so many different aspects, in student engagement. It measures digital learning environment. It measures giving feedback to the students when the teacher is teaching. How are the students communicating with each other? So that's one research-based rubric that we have utilized to generate our rubric partially. And that rubric was generated using observations from 47,000 classrooms. And they took the mean of each single one of those elements and they measured the implementation. Another resource that we used to generate this rubric for high impact strategy was the Marzano's rubric and also the Danielson's rubric that we're using with our teachers' evaluation. So we've used research-based different rubrics to generate our own that made it much simpler for the teachers and for the administrators to work with. And much of the professional development, as I mentioned, is reflecting this rubric. And in the general sessions for the general admin, we have sessions where we train the principals on it. We've been collecting feedback because this is the first semester it's been implemented. And based on that feedback, we're going to revise it and provide additional tools for the principals to be able to really look for indicators of what that specific element.
Then just to take on to that, because all three of you are basically don't have a long history with the SIP process in your new roles that you've taken on here in the district to have a history with it. But my question would be then, since we've been doing the school improvement plan process, one would anticipate that once you've gone in and evaluated a building and decided what kind of things should be engaged in that building to help improve the educational outcomes, that it would be maintained, sustained, and then grow each year upon that. Are we tracking that to make sure that each school continues to head in that direction, or are they slipping back again after time and we have to repeat the process over and over again?
Well, even though I wasn't in my current role, I mean, this is my second year now, superintendent, but I was involved from human resources. I was also involved as a principal, and I would go to other schools. I was actually one of the first principals when we first started the process in 2006. I sat on the committee and went into all the different schools. And so I've seen actually the longitudinal view since we've actually started the implementation. I can tell you that we've seen dramatic improvements across the district in that time. When you go and you see the evidence in the classroom, we are really looking and focusing on research-based best practices. What I call the school improvement is a collection of input data. What is that? That's not the achievement test data. They present that. It's really what is the instructional practices that are happening in the classroom. One of the most powerful things that we've seen since the feeder track model, which we just started last year, was now that the sharing of strategies among the buildings. So you have teachers that are coming on the visits, you have administrators, and now what you see is that they are involved in the process. And so that's that greater district PL learning community. Mm-hmm. And so you're seeing the strategies popping up all over the district Some may be a little higher up in certain areas versus others, but we do track that data because they get a feedback sheet after.
Right.
This rubric is going to help us. This is the first year of the rubric. That's
Right.
going to help us more intensively track it. What we used to do is, based on their plan, we would look at what they asked us to look for and we would track it. Now it's consistent. It still allows some individuality, and that's where the strategic plan is going to connect everything. The strategic plan will connect that process so that we have a full district implementing it. But within the strategic plan and within the feeder check, that's why we're doing the feeders, to allow for some uniqueness within the school communities, because the needs of every school are not exactly the same. So you have to balance that full district need and instructional strategies, best practice, with what are the unique needs of those buildings
Yeah, it's
or
not
those
a cookie
individual.
cutter,
It
one
is.
size.
And if you go in, I'm just going to say I'm proud of Dearborn Schools because I'm proud of our teachers, our staff, our parents go on these visits with us. And I think Trustee Petlichkoff, you even said, well, the difference is when you get in the class.
Way different from when my children were in the building. Yeah.
So the state can come up with a score, or the federal, or whoever, and I'm not just talking about Dearborn, anywhere. But until you actually are in that school and see what's going on and get a feel for it, you really don't have a good analysis. And Etzel Ford would be an example of that. What did we just experience? So that's why I feel like that portion and the thing that we're doing, I spend a tremendous amount of time because of the 36 school programs. I go to every school twice a year for the school improvement. We're invested in it. We know it's an important process, so we're proud of it as well.
Thank you.
I have to say, I know that I've seen a difference in the last 2 years with my kids and their teachers and what they're doing in the classrooms as well. I do have a question, though, in terms of the data. I noticed the math averages were higher. How much of that can be attributed to? We do have a lot of English learners in our district, and math is a universal language. And I was just wondering how much of that maybe was because of that.
There is probably a little bit of that in terms of some of the gaps that we see. It is actually a little smaller in mathematics than what we do see in English language arts. And in terms of mathematics, our scores did not drop quite as much in mathematics as we saw in language arts in terms of the transition from online to paper and pencil testing. So I think it's a combination of a few different factors.
And I guess for people, and I know we talk about this every week, but it is worth pointing out, even though our scores are slightly below the state average, that is our scores across the district, and we have a lot of English language learners in our district. And so I think that's worth pointing out that our students are doing very well. We just have a very diverse group of students. And it's harder to take a test when you don't read or, speak that language.
And many are coming from educational background that isn't complete or is very lacking.
And so the fact that it's that close, I think, is a thing that we should be really proud of for people who are seeing that.
We're doing as well as we're doing.
We're doing as well as we're doing. And I think for people who are seeing that, that's just something I wanted to point out.
Can I add a comment? And that is why we're looking at that, which my presentation, a multiple measures approach. That's why we have the NWA. If you look, our students come, we look at those data sets, but they're growing at above average marks according to the national. But they come at a lot of times with students that come with low English. They come with at a lower level, and that's just reality, And so, at the same token, we are accountable to move forward. We're accountable for the achievement of our students in our district. We take that on. We're very excited. We're excited for the program we're offering, and we appreciate the support of the board and all the great work that our staff do. And again, the parents are involved in this as well. So. Thank you for the comments, and it's something that we're going to continue to move forward and continue to address the needs of our schools on a holistic manner in our district, but also balance that with individualizing their needs within the schools.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, item 7, action items.
I think we have an audit report.
Where are we? Oh, we're still in special reports. Okay. I'm just reeling from the last report. Okay. P through 12, audit report. Dr. Glenn Maleko, Mr. Thomas Wall.
Thank you, Dr. Malenko, Madam President, members of the board. One more presentation. As by law, we're required to have an annual audit. We've engaged Plant Moran for that audit, and today to report out on the audit is the partner, Teresa Pollack, and the manager, Tom Marchese.
Thank you very much. It's our pleasure to be here this evening. So as Mr. Wall reported, you are required to undergo an independent audit. And our role as your independent auditors is to conduct your audit and to render our opinions relative to the accuracy of the district's financial statements, and also to perform a compliance single audit relative to the federal program requirements. So we're very happy to report we did have an excellent audit process, and we found the books and records of the district to be free of any errors, and we're able to render an unmodified opinion. So that is the language for a clean opinion and the highest level of assurance that we can give as to the accuracy of the statements.
Yay, that's good. That's good.
And relative to the compliance with the federal awards programs, the district expends over $20 million under its federal award programs each year. This year, we tested as major programs the special education, Title II, and child nutrition programs here at the district, and we did not identify any findings or noncompliance conditions, nor did we identify any internal control deficiencies to be reported to the board. So there again, very good news. I'm going to turn it over to Tom. He's going to run through some of the financial highlights of the year, and then we'll respond to any questions.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
So I'll begin with slide number 1, which just gives you a overview of the total assets, total liabilities, and the GASB 68 liability, the impact on a fund level and government-wide activities. So you can see that on the government-wide level, the GASB 68 liability amounts to $343 million, and the fund level has no impact with GASB 68. So overall, your net position is at a deficit on the government-wide basis of $167 million, and at a fund level, your fund balance is at a positive $33.3 million. Again, this is all triggered by the GASB 68 liability. The gap between the fund level and government-wide figures relate to the absence of capital assets and bonded liabilities at the fund level. Slide 2 gives a brief commentary on the GASB 68, year 2 of its implementation. So if you may recall, last year was the first year. Each district is assigned a proportionate share of the net pension liability. So again, there's no fund level impact, and rating agencies have already considered the pension obligation, and it should not impact the district bond ratings. Nearly all districts will present a deficit net position because of this GASB 68 liability. On slide 3, we discuss we present the general fund assets and liabilities. You can see that there's $49 million of assets in the general fund. The primary portion of it relates to receivables that are comprised of July and August state aid and not drawn down federal funds. Liabilities are $35 million at year end, and the largest portion of that relates to the $19.6 million of accrued payroll, which is for the contracted employees that are due salaries in the summer. Slide 4 presents a spread of the general fund revenue. You can see that there's a 2.8% increase year over year in the general fund revenue. The primary component of the general fund revenue would be the foundation allowance and other state sources. And in 2016, that represents 77% of general fund revenue. Slide 5, we provide a breakout of instruction versus support for total general fund expenditures. In 2016, we have 60% as instruction and 37% as support services. Instruction expenditures are comprised of direct classroom activities. It excludes operating costs and any support for student activities. The 2015 to 2016 increase is roughly 4.6%. Slide 6, we have another breakout for the general fund expenditures. As you can see, 86% of general fund expenditures are represented by salaries and fringes. So that is approximately $168 million of your $194 million of general fund expenditures.
You're in the people business.
Slide 7 offers a history of your increase in fund balance for your general fund. So in the current year, 2016 fiscal year end, you have a $1.35 million increase in general fund balance. And you can see that in 2013, there was a decrease in fund balance, but from 2014 onward, you have been above the line, above break even, and you built a comfortable safety margin in your fund balance for the general fund. Slide 8 just offers a breakout of your fund balance percentage of expenditures compared to the state average. So in 2015, the state average, excluding Detroit and East Detroit school districts, was 10.06%. You can see that in 2016, the fund balance for the general fund is approximately 7.35%, meaning you're below the state average, but you're above the 5% threshold that's required for this early warning legislation. And again, it's trending upward with the recent increases since 2014. So it's definitely a good sign.
So those are the highlights of the financial results for the year. We'd be happy to address any questions relative to the financial results or the audit process. Trustee Guida?
2 questions. Is our pension liability increasing each year?
Yes, and unfortunately it is. So the underfunding at the state level does continue to increase, and so those proportionate shares are increasing. The other thing that's going to come into play relative to that pension liability, that does not include the payments that are required for health coverage for retirees at the state. That computed obligation right now only relates to the pension portion, and beginning in the 2008 fiscal year, there will be a new change in the accounting standards that will also bring in that health piece.
And we heard the same at the college.
Yeah, exactly.
Then I guess my second question that I ask you every year, our fund balance percentage is still, even though it's growing, it's not at the level that we'd like it to be.
Yes.
So I would urge that, we consider some of the monies that may come in under the millage to target to continue to increase our fund balance. Because I think, Tom, do we still borrow?
Yes.
We still borrow. Well, I'm not going to be around much longer, but I'd certainly like to hear someday that we're not borrowing anymore, that we've got enough of our own capital available to get us through the summer and those things. Because the interest is still just money that's gone, that we would rather see used somewhere else in the district, in a classroom if we can. So I just urge the board to continue to put pressure on our superintendent to pocket a little bit of money every year till we get that fund balance up where everybody's comfortable with it.
How much does it cost us to borrow?
You know, Tom, you probably off the top of your head know your borrowing
Sorry.
rate right now.
We do a tax-free type borrowing for our district, and it's usually offer of the market rate that day plus 1% roughly.
Okay.
So depending on what the market rate is that day, you know, that we have to pay a slightly fee above that.
So I'm not a numbers person at all. How, like, usually what that is.
What does that mean in dollars?
How much money?
What does that mean in dollars?
So it all depends how long we actually borrow. So this year we had a line of credit for $14 million, but over the summer months, as you can see, that large receivable from the state is $28 million. That's money that we've already spent by June 30th and going to spend over the summer, so we don't have the cash reserve in our fund balance to cover us. So therefore, over the summer months, we borrow roughly about $4 million for a 3-month span. And that's roughly just under 3%. So when you look at that, that's $120,000, but you got to divide it by the 10 months. So probably about $25,000 in interest cost.
Okay.
It's
Better
3
than
students.
It used to be.
Yeah.
It's been reduced because previous years we were borrowing more. So the last
Yeah.
It's much better than it used to be.
Oh, yeah.
8, 10, 16.
You know, as you can see, our fund balance has been growing slowly, so the converse happens that we have to borrow less money during the summer months.
So our increasing the fund balance is costing us less over time as well.
Correct.
That's why we need to keep pushing to increase it to the point where we don't have to borrow.
And it's so
You're
important
right.
to have that cushion because you never know what's going to happen.
Is-
You know, there's-
Is there a risk that they may increase? They're saying, right now the state says we have to have, was it 5%?
That's where they send you a warning.
yeah,
Is
they-
there a risk that they may increase that amount?
Yeah, well, so the early warning legislation, so there are a couple of different things that can trigger a district hitting the watch list. The one that's sort of automatic is if you do experience that fund balance below 5% of your revenue. That's an automatic flag that you'll go into the heightened reporting of the early warning. The other thing that has triggered districts there's a separate trend test that they're doing at the state where they're watching declines in enrollment, deficit spending, and things like that. And those are also some of the triggers that can bring it into play.
Okay. Thank you.
And you can see our revenue is 77% from the state, so we're very, reliable on how the state funding happens every year, and it's not something you can correct right away. It's something you have to plan forward and look at future years of how to adjust toward it.
You have to remember that we've had the advantage of an enrollment increase.
28 years.
Yeah.
20-some years.
Yeah.
So, we could be in a lot worse shape. Other districts are losing students and opening to school of choice and doing all the things that they can to try to survive. We've been pretty fortunate that we've had enrollment to support our district for all these years. And it's good and bad because we spent a lot of money expanding schools and, adding on and doing all the things that you have to do to take care of your enrollment. But I think in the long run, we would have been a lot worse off and we've been a declining district versus a growing district.
We have
Yes.
a community that always supports the school.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, we have a $78 million bond issue to show for
Yeah.
that. So, yeah, we've been good, but we need to keep the pressure on Dr. Maleka. Put a little bit away every year.
It is in my goals, and the other benefit to we're hiring more people. Well, that's a great positive in the local economy. I mean, we're the 5th largest employer in the Wayne County, was in Cranes, and that's even gone up. So it's actually a positive for the local community when you're hiring, 100 plus teachers the way we have been, and or not just teachers but other staff. So, that's a real positive. But yes, I heard you, Trustee Guido.
You feel it
Years
already?
old.
That's my annual.
Did you have?
I just want to thank Ms. Sterrett, who's very indeed involved in the audit from day in to day out over the summer months. Mrs. Misko, Mrs. Sand, and all the other business services staff. I just want to make sure we thank them for all the hard work they do for this.
And thank them for sure.
Yeah.
Thank
And
you.
we echo that. We'd like to thank all of the staff here. We have terrific support, and it's not a fun process being audited.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.